Thank you, Julie. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many people so early in the morning here to talk about Daf Yomi. It's a full session, so I can only see 25 of you at a time on the screen. I was going to do a poll where we all raised our hands and we could see, but it won't be. I won't see even a good sample. But do me a favor, type, besides people are coming in and saying where they're from in the chat, but I'd love to see who's reading Daf Yomi, from the Talmud. Who's reading Daf Yomi from just by the Daily Dose of Talmud. You can leave a note in the chat about how you're doing Daf Yomi. And it's okay to say, this is my first Daf Yomi anything. Send us a chat and let's, as it scrolls through, we'll see what, we'll maybe get a sense of the room. Oh, Daily Dose is enough for me, someone said. That's good. Oh, we got a whole mix. That's great. Excellent. So if you're doing Daf Yomi, you know it's a time commitment every day. And when Julie and I first talked about how do we put a week into 30 minutes, that was like a good Gemara question. How do you put a week of Daf Yomi into 30 minutes? And we had some good back and forth about that. What I'd love to do is I want to share with you some highlights from the current week of Daf Yomi, which, at least for the purposes of today, we're defining from last Sunday until this coming Shabbat, and gonna give you a sneak peek at something that's coming for next week. Hopefully it'll be a little cliffhanger, so you'll pick up the Talmud or come back next week. I have a slide deck that I'm gonna share right now, and I'm gonna take you through a few texts. I would love to be able to take as many questions as I can, but we're a really large group. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat, and Julie's good at tracking as many of them as we'll be able to fit in, and hopefully at the end we'll have a few minutes to tackle them as we go. All right, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to hit the present button. Here we go. All right, so highlights of this week in Gemara, in Daf Yomi, and a sneak peek to what's coming ahead. So this week, a few days ago, we started a new chapter that started on Tractate Yoma, page 47. The Gemara is taking us through the ceremony in the temple. What happened on Yom Kippur in the temple, with a real focus on the high priest, who was the star of the show. And as we opened up this new chapter on page 47, it went to a focus of the high priest going to collect the incense that's burned in the temple on Yom Kippur. And I thought the Mishnah that appears on the page was a good way to give us a sense of the main topic of what's happening this week. So the Mishnah says the following: they brought out the spoon and the coal pan to the high priest so he may perform the service of the incense. Right? He scoops his handfuls from the incense and places it into the spoon. So the high priest scoops incense with his hands and then drops the incense from his hands into the spoon. Here's what the Mishnah says. This is the part I thought was most interesting. The high priest with large hands fills the spoon with incense in an amount corresponding to the large size of his hands. And the high priest with small hands fills the spoon with incense in an amount corresponding to the small size of his hands. So different high priests, different people, as we know, have different size hands. And so the amount of incense that they'll scoop with their hands varies from one high priest to the other. So any given year, depending on who the high priest is, a different amount of incense will be burned on Yom Kippur. And then the Mishnah says, and this was the measure of the spoon, meaning it was made to correspond to the size of the hands. So each high priest had a spoon designed for him based on the size of his hands that would hold a handful of incense. So what I love about this, there's a recipe for Yom Kippur, but it doesn't say half a cup of incense or 2 pounds of incense. It says, we use the incense based on the size of the hands of the high priest, which varies. And not only that, but a spoon had to be made to carry that incense, crafted particularly for the hand size of the high priest. And I thought this is an odd sort of thing to do. But I wanted to give you a hint, which the Gemara tells you a little later about where this comes from. I just added a line to the bottom of the slide. This is all based on the rabbinic reading of a verse from Vayikra, Leviticus, that says, and he, the high priest, shall take from it his handful of the fine flour of the meal offering and of its oil. They use a verse that's about flour of the meal offering and oil, but it also applies to Yom Kippur. They apply it because the focus here is the priest takes his handful, right? The Hebrew word is bekumtso. And the idea is when scooping, you're supposed to use your hands. And you're supposed to take a handful, and it's based upon the size of your hands. And from close reading of verses in the Torah, the rabbis determined that in the temple, they didn't use fixed quantities, but scooping was done by handful. And that meant on Yom Kippur, different size handfuls were offered depending on the high priest. And so this week we launched this chapter. It spends a lot of time focused on the high priest and the scooping and the spoon and the depositing of the incense in and around the temple. There's a lot that's very technical this week, and if you're interested in all those technical details, I would refer you to the Yoma, page 47 and following, which you can find on Sefaria or some other places. And while I wanted to give you an orientation to what the general sense of the theme of this week was, I didn't want to be too technical, so I selected some other passages for us to look at. And part of what's nice about picking a few passages for a short 30-minute overview is you get to pick the ones that you think are the most fun. So 2 passages that I thought were a lot of fun from this week's reading. So I'm jumping ahead a few pages. Yoma, page 53, side A. The Gemara teaches us, a student who takes leave of his teacher should not turn his face and walk, but turn his face sideways and walk. Meaning, when you're studying with your teacher and it's time to get up and go, you shouldn't turn your back to your teacher, but you should sort of walk sideways so that you always keep some eye contact with your teacher. And this has to do a little bit with the respect you have for your teacher, that you want to face your teacher and give them that respect even as you're exiting the room. I don't know how many people notice, this is related to another teaching that if you might notice this in synagogue, I hope soon is the day when we all get to go back to synagogue. There are people who, when they have an aliyah or they open the ark, or for some reason they're on the bima, when they walk off the bima, they turn and face the ark and sort of walk down the stairs backwards. It's the same theory as this teaching here. When you walk away from Torah, you shouldn't turn your back to Torah. So people turn sideways or backwards, so they're facing Torah and try to walk off the bima facing the Torah, giving Torah the same respect that this text says we should give to our teachers. What I love about this teaching is, I think it's a nice teaching itself, but I love a story that comes with it. The Gemara tells this story. It's a short story, which is nice because we only have 30 minutes. It says, when Rava took leave of Rav Yosef, Rava was a student of Rav Yosef, he would walk backwards until his legs were bruised and the threshold of Rav Yosef's house was bloodied. So Rava took this teaching very seriously. He would walk backwards and he wouldn't be concerned for what was behind him. He wanted to make sure he kept eye contact with his teacher to the point at which his legs got bruised from bumping into things or maybe the doorway, and said, it's a little graphic, this is a PG-13 section, maybe. He was so serious about his adherence to this mitzvah, to this practice, that he did it at the risk to bruising his legs and maybe even cutting them and, bleeding over the doorway of Rabbi Yosef's house. I find this to be humorous, and when I found the story, I brought a big smile to my face, just trying to picture this rabbi leaving, being so attentive to focus on his teacher that he would injure himself leaving the place of study. I think it's also meant, a little tongue-in-cheek by the Gemara to say it's important to take the principles we learn here and rabbinic thinking seriously, but there are limits to it. My reading of this also is that Rava in in his diligence to this practice, maybe took it a little too far. You should make sure, if you do decide to walk off the bima of your synagogue backwards, or you do decide to leave class, facing your teacher still, do it carefully. You shouldn't come away with bumps and bruises, and certainly not, bloody the doorway. So a word of warning from the story of Rava. All right, that was one of the fun passages. Here's my next favorite one. This is from my friend Rabbi Janina Mendoza, one of my favorite rabbis in the Talmud, and I'm excited because I'm actually writing a piece for my Jewish learning about this. There's going to be a new Talmud series that's going to support the daily dose of Talmud. I don't know if they've started to advertise it yet, so maybe you're hearing about it first, but I was asked to write about Janina Mendoza. Janina Mendoza is in many stories about him in the Talmud. He's sometimes a miracle worker. He sometimes has sort of a unique way of moving through the world. He was seen as a master, a rabbinic master, but he's not so much known for halachic teaching, right? He doesn't appear in a lot of debates about Jewish law. But he has a unique, I guess, religious, spiritual personality, which we'll see a little bit in this story. This is coincidence, it's raining at my house. Sorry about the gray of my Zoom window. My sunny window isn't sunny today, but this is a little bit about rain. So it's fortuitous for those of you in the Northeast where it's raining today. So Rabbi Janina Mendoza was walking on the road and rain fell upon him. This is a text about tefillah. So he's walking on the road and rain fell upon him, so he was getting wet. So he offers a prayer. Master of the universe, the entire world is comfortable and Janina is suffering. That's his statement that he makes to God. This is part of what we see in his character in the Talmud of Janina Mendoza. God listens to Rabbi Janina Mendoza. The rain stops in response to his statement. Imagine if you had that power. I was shopping this weekend and leaving the store with groceries and it was pouring rain, and I wish I had said, the whole world's comfortable and I'm suffering, and then I wish the rain had stopped, but I don't have the same magnitude of influence that Rabbi Janina Mendoza says. But then he does have a kindness, though, because when he came home to his house and got inside, he said, Master of the universe, the entire world is suffering for lack of rain, and Janina is comfortable, and the spigots come back on and the rain comes back. So Janina Mendoza, not only does this show a moment of which we see in many of the stories about him, where he and God have an intimate relationship, and God listens to Janina Mendoza and affects what happens in the world, or at least Mother Nature does here. But while he's concerned for his personal comfort, while he's out and about, as soon as he gets home, he recognizes that the greater good is actually the rain, because especially in the Middle East, even before global warming a couple millennia ago, they still needed rain all the time in Israel. And so the fact that the rain stopped so he could get home dry, he knew was put suffering on the world. So he turns the rain back on as soon as he's safely inside. So he shows some self-indulgence, and then he shows some thinking about the greater world as a whole. So I hope you like these two snippets from the past week. Neither of them have to do with the incense, which is the Mishnah that opens the chapter. I don't know about you if you're reading along. I'm finding it's a grind getting through the detailed Talmudic discussion about the particulars of the ceremonies in the temple. And it was nice that sprinkled amongst those texts that really pages and pages that delve into the incense and the spoon and the handfuls and the high priest and all the different size hands. It was nice to find two different things to talk about today. And let me check my time. Oh, we're going to have time for questions. That's good. But first, peek to next week. I want to leave you with some drama. I thought about soap operas. Stay tuned next time. The rabbis are debating. The rabbis in the Talmud, some are from the land of Israel and some are from Babylonia. And in the Beit Midrash in the land of Israel, Rabbi Yirmiyah is teaching, and his students bring an answer to a question. It doesn't even matter for our purposes here what that is. They bring an answer that comes from the schools in Babylonia. And Rabbi Yirmiyah responds to them saying, "Foolish Babylonians, because they live in a dark, low land, they speak darkened halachot, devoid of logic. Just wanted to give you a little drama. There's sometimes a rivalry between the rabbis of Babylonia and the rabbis of Eretz Yisrael. And while sometimes they get along, we know a number of rabbinic characters who travel back and forth between the academies, sharing information from one place to the other. But sometimes they didn't get along so well. And here's an example of Rabbi Yirmiyah critiquing his colleagues from far away in stark rabbinic terms, calling them foolish. Maybe that the drama of that. Stay tuned. Will the Babylonian rabbis respond? How will they defend themselves after being insulted by Rabbi Yirmiyah? Will a fistfight break out in the Beit Midrash? Oh no, that only happens in the Knesset from every decade or so, not necessarily in the Beit Midrash. Stay tuned and you'll see a little sneak peek into next week. All right, those are the texts I have for today. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Julie has or will again put into the chat a link that will let you view these slides. And on one foot, and very quickly, that was some snippets from all last week and a little text from next week, a taste of what's in Daf Yomi. All right, I saw as I was talking, 20 or so messages come into the chat. Julie, do you want to feed me some questions?
Absolutely, and folks can use your the raise hand function as well if you'd like to ask your question. Michael Asher asked, sorry. In 50A and B, they argue back and forth whether the Kohen Gadol is an individual offering, a communal offering, or a partner offering. I'm not sure they ever decide the issue. Isn't it all three? Could you explain, please, the ramifications of why this matters?
Oh, all right. That's a doozy to start off with. Thank you, Michael, for that question. I will tell you this conversation continues because of my writing for Daily Dose and Talmud. I'm actually a couple weeks ahead, so you haven't seen the last of the conversation about this. I'll give you a little bit of background, and I'll try to do my best to answer. My fear is that it will still be insufficient. It's true, the high priest represents himself and his family and all the Jewish people on Yom Kippur. And the rabbis, in their conversations in these pages, get into some technical issues about, are the sacrifices that he brings individual sacrifices for him or communal sacrifices for the Jewish people as a whole? And those questions are very technical. So I want to get to one answer to what you asked, Michael, which is why does it matter? One of the reasons why it matters is some of the conversation, this might sound technical to everybody about this, but some of the conversation is about what happens if the animal that's supposed to be sacrificed, that's designated for sacrifice, dies and has to be replaced? Or what happens if it's lost and then a new one is designated, but then the original one is found? And the question of, is the sacrifice communal or individual, in part has to do with what happens if the animal's lost and you designate a new one, and then the first one's found, and then you have two animals that have been designated for the sacrifice. The rules for sacrifices are different for communal sacrifices and individual sacrifices. But I want to make sure I line it up right. I might not remember. I might have to go back to the text to see which goes to which. But if one of the sets of sacrifices, you have to let the designated animal just graze until it dies, because once it's designated, you can't use it for anything else. And in the other case, I believe that's for the individual offering, but I might have that wrong. And then for the communal offering, if I'm right, you can sell the animal and use the proceeds of the sale for other sacred purposes. So the conversation about what's the status of the sacrifice has to do with these individual cases of what happens if you have an animal that's been designated that can't be sacrificed, what's its future? And that's where the rabbis get into that. The confusion though comes up because the Kohen Gadol, when he goes into the Holy of Holies to confess and do this whole ritual, has to seek individual repentance and before he seeks communal repentance. And it's not always clear in the Torah, or as the rabbis talk it through, if this is meant to be, which sacrifices are for him alone and which represent all of them. So Michael, I hope that helps a little bit. And to those who are, I hope it was tolerable for those who, this chapter is too technical. Try to balance between the two. All right, Julie, what else do we have?
All right, so we have another question from Mark, and then I'm going to launch actually a short poll for the question that you asked earlier about how you study Talmud.
Oh, nice.
What sources do you use when you study Talmud?
What sources do I use? Oh, so I can answer first. When for Daf Yomi, I have a subscription to the Koren Talmud, which has both the original Aramaic and Hebrew, and Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz's commentary translated into English. And I do that for Daf Yomi because of the pace of the Daf Yomi. When I'm studying slowly and for more depth, I'll study from the original text. I have a whole shelf of dictionaries and other resources that I go to. Most helpful, if you're doing it that way, to me is Marcus Jastrow's Aramaic dictionary, which is also online now on Safaria, and Yaakov Frank's terminology dictionary are both real helpful tools for me. When I'm writing for the Daf Yomi blog, I can pick from a whole array of books depending on what I'm looking for. You know, I often look to Rashi and Tosafot, the main commentaries on the page, to see what they have to say. And depending on the topic I'm going to write about, I can turn both to modern scholars or medieval scholars, or sometimes both, to see how they resolve different issues. For Daf Yomi, Koren has been a lifesaver for me. The pace at which Daf Yomi is going would make it impossible for me at this point to do in the original. And I've actually been thinking a little bit about how do we read Talmud for Daf Yomi differently from how do we read Talmud in other settings. Somewhere there's an Elliot Goldberg blog piece emerging about that, but every 6 months I have new thoughts about Daf Yomi. So I'm trying to figure out when I've done enough of Daf Yomi to write about it. So we're about 1.5 years in. I figure by year 3, halfway through, maybe my thoughts will gel.
All right, we're going to launch a quick poll if folks could, I'm just curious, and then we can all see where one another is learning their Talmud from. And in the meantime, if there are any more questions, we will have time for another question or two after the poll.
Awesome. Julie, this is why you're a good facilitator. This is a great live action use of Zoom.
Love the poll feature.
I'm getting live results as they come in. Is that for everybody or just the facilitators?
Just the facilitators, but I'll share the results in just about 10 seconds.
All right, I'm not going to spill the secret that I'm seeing.
All right, 5 more seconds to vote. All righty. Okay, we allowed people to have multiple answers, of course, because you might be studying on different places, but close to 90% of you from the Daily Dose, and then half of you directly also from the Talmud, and then some of you with partners, or a podcast. Well, anyway, you can see the results. Interesting.
Nice. I was going to give a plug for the Daily Dose of Talmud, but I feel like you guys are already on board.
Yeah.
I have to say, I think it's nearing 40,000 recipients with a daily open rate of about 40%, which is unheard of in this age of email. You know, if you're involved in a nonprofit or professionally with email opens, people dream about 40% open rate. So thanks for supporting it.
Yay, Talmud study years.
Yeah.
Kapita has asked, can you say a few words on the Kimchi story?
On the Kimchi story, but now you're pressing my memory. Can you give me a little? I could maybe, but I'd have to remember the story. As I said before, I'm actually 2 weeks ahead, so the details don't come.
Kapita, if you want to unmute and share a little more about your question.
No, sorry, I'm having the same problem. I remember the name. It was a woman who had something about her having been such a good person, and then she said, "But why did this happen to me?" And then
Oh, is this
that's the hair in the house. The story about hiding her hair in her house. So
yes, there's a story. I actually think someone wrote about it in the Daily Dose of Talmud. Because I remember, I think that was the topic on the David page, right? I think the story is, right, she showed modesty and she hid her hair. And as a result, all 7 of her children got to serve at one point as the Kohen Gadol. But then there's a counter voice in the Talmud that says, it happened that all 7 of her children who got to be Kohen Gadol, but it wasn't like a reward for this meritorious deed. I can give you one take on that. This is my own personal take on this, but right, some of the story I think is about, right, the rabbis thinking about reward and punishment. If you do right, will you be rewarded? What struck me about this story is, right, the doing right for this woman and mother is being modest and staying in her house and covering her hair. For me, it touches on issues of the ways in which the world has changed since the time of the rabbis, where I would love to see women, whether they cover their hair or not for personal choice, but out in the rabbinic conversation as opposed to in the house. And I would like to see, you know, much more, you know, balanced and egalitarian sharing of household responsibilities, child raising, and Torah study. That's my own take on that. You know, it also raises the question, which the rabbis raise in the text themselves, is there reward and punishment in this day and age? And I also wonder, it was interesting to me that in that story, the high priest, becoming the high priest is a reward, where my read of these opening chapters of Yoma, where the rabbis are sort of scripting what happens on Yom Kippur, is that the rabbis are so controlling, and it's so many times they talk about how the sages have to tell the high priest what to do. I think in a lot of other places, like being the high priest, the rabbis don't think so highly of the high priest and want to make sure there's a rabbi in the room to make sure the high priest does it right. But yet in this story, they say it's a good kavod, it's a great honor to be the high priest. But I don't think they always think so in the rest of the chapter. So I saw that contrast. I would go back, if you can in Safari put in Kimchi, you'll find the page. I think if you then find the Daily Dose of Talmud, that one of my colleagues wrote their piece on that day about this page. So I hope that that's a little response. I did remember the story. Thanks.